Welcome to Educate for Life Online. This is the fourth class in our course, Created on Purpose or Evolved by Chance. Today we're going to be talking about dating methods, as in how old is the Earth and how do we know?
So this is my 11th video now on Kevin Conover's online course for Young Earth Creationism and the first in the series of the Age of the Earth and Why It Matters. So let's get started.
If you'll look on the screen here, you'll see a bunch of scientists that are up here on the board. These four guys each hold different views on the age of the Earth. The first one is Richard Dawkins. He's an atheist and an evolutionist. He says that the Bible is made-up stories and that it can't be trusted. The second guy is Francis Collins. He's a scientist, he's a Christian, but he is a theistic evolutionist. He believes that God allowed evolution to make everything that we see today. He says that the Bible is somewhat trustworthy, not with science, especially not Genesis. Now, he would argue that he believes the Bible is completely trustworthy, but he doesn't take the Bible strictly at what it says. Even if it's historical narrative, he'll say some parts are poetry or metaphor. The third guy we have here is an old Earth creationist, and his name is Hugh Ross. Now, Hugh Ross says the Bible is completely trustworthy and that it doesn't deny that the Earth is old. Now, this is important. You'll notice I have that underlined there. He says the Bible doesn't deny that the Earth is old, but it doesn't state directly that the Earth is old. And then we have Ken Ham. He says the Bible is completely trustworthy and it clearly teaches the Earth is young. Which of these positions is the most logical, the most biblical, and the most scientific position to take? That's what we're going to look at today.
Well, it's interesting enough that he doesn't have any scientists there that actually deals with questions about the age of the Earth, like geologists or maybe cosmologists. But, Francis Collins, he and Hugh Ross both think young Earth creationists are an embarrassment. I've got my own problems with Hugh Ross, though. I mean, while he accepts the age of the Earth, he's got some real crazy ideas on the rest of it. And that I have another series, video series that I'm doing on his ministry. I have no idea why he included Ken Ham. I mean, he's not a scientist. He never has been. He's a creationism salesman who's famous for the line, "Were you there?"
Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on atheism or evolution today because this one is really not one we're arguing for as Christians. Nobody really argues for atheism as Christians. But atheism and evolution together believe that there was nothing, and nothing happened to nothing, and then nothing magically exploded for no reason, creating everything, and then a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason whatsoever into self-replicating bits, which then turned into dinosaurs. Does that make perfect sense? I don't think so.
So evidently popular internet memes are part of his research. This has to be one of the most shared and most stupid memes I've ever seen about atheism that's shared by young Earth creationists. No one believes this. This isn't what we thought happened. You're creating a straw man, and you make yourself look like an idiot.
What about a theistic evolutionist? What do they believe? Well, they believe the Earth is billions of years old, along with the universe. They say that God is real, but largely uninvolved in the process of evolution or creation. He started the Big Bang and then he just let it go. And then the laws of physics took over and everything came together on its own without God's intervention. The universe and life randomly and by chance all created itself through the natural laws established by God. What about an old Earth creationist? Hugh Ross says, we go with science even though the Bible seems to teach that the Earth is young. There are a variety of ways to fit an old Earth within the biblical history. Within the old Earth position, there are a variety of different sub-positions that you can take as an old Earth creationist. There's what's called the gap theory, there's the day-age theory, there's progressive creation theory, and there's also what's called the framework hypothesis. We'll talk about each one of those as we continue on here. Lastly, the young Earth creationist position says this: the Earth is about 6,000 years old. Science is always learning and always changing, and is therefore less reliable than the historical accounts recorded in the Bible. There is plenty of factual scientific data that indicates the Earth and universe are only about 6,000 years old, as recorded in the Bible. Now, I just want to emphasize the difference between the old Earth position and the young Earth position. Remember, the old Earth position says the Bible doesn't deny that the Earth is old, whereas the young Earth position says that the Bible overtly, very directly teaches that the earth is young. You get to decide which of these perspectives makes the most sense to you from a biblical, scientific, historical, and logical perspective. You be the judge.
I really won't be talking much about theistic evolutionists or old earth creationists on the age of the earth because they agree with me on that. Kevin seems to miss, though, the very foundation of the young earth creationist argument. Most young earth creationist salesmen will readily admit that they start with what they believe the Bible says about the age of the earth, and then they try to make the science fit and reject what doesn't fit.
Okay, so let's look at the alternatives within the old earth creationist position. The first one we're going to look at is called the gap theory. Now, the gap theory says that God had a completely separate creation that he made, but it was destroyed during a war between Satan and God in a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Here it is right out of the text. Genesis 1:1 through 2, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, gap, right there, you see it? Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So the gap theory proponents argue that all of the first creation got destroyed in that gap. There was a gigantic war between Satan and the demons, and God and the angels. Satan was thrown out of heaven, and in the process, as they were swinging their swords, they killed all the dinosaurs. Now, really, that's what gap theory proponents believe, that the fight was so ferocious that all of the creation got destroyed. Now, you might ask yourself, what's wrong with this theory? What is it about this that doesn't make sense to me?
Once again, I don't agree with this theory, but at least they accept billions of years.
Okay, this is what's called ad hoc. ADHOC. It's when you just tack something on to try to make it fit your perspective. Okay, we don't want things to be ad hoc. The more that a theory or a hypothesis requires ad hoc items or ad hoc stories, the more likely it is not to be true. Now, it doesn't guarantee that it's not true. It's just less likely to be true than a theory or an explanation that doesn't have ad hoc items, just things thrown in there to try to make sense of it. Okay, so
it's funny watching different types of creationists accuse each other of logical fallacies when they're also guilty of it themselves.
The next one is called the day-age theory. Each day in Genesis represents an age of some sort, not an actual day. Therefore, the universe and the earth can be billions of years old. So every day in that 6 days of creation represents some sort of an age or time frame. Now, of course, the difficulty here is that even if each day represented a billion years, you only have about 6 billion years when evolutionists and those who believe in an old universe believe the universe is somewhere around 15 billion years old. So you do have a problem there. Progressive creation theory says that God started creation, but every once in a while, he does some more creating. They also believe in this theory that the days represent indefinite ages. So in this theory, it makes up a little bit for the idea that you only have 6 billion years by saying each day isn't necessarily the same amount of time. They still believe in Adam and Eve. They still believe in a literal Garden of Eden, but they just believe that the creation has existed for a lot longer than Adam and Eve. The last one is the framework hypothesis, and this one says a day is a day, but Genesis 1 is poetic, not historical narrative. Now, the problem with the framework hypothesis is that you can tell what is history in the Bible and what is poetic. And there have been quite a few studies done on this, and they'll look at, for example, the amount of adjectives in the writing. If there's a lot of adjectives, it's more likely to be poetic than it is to be historical narrative. Now, there are all kinds of ways to determine when something's poetry and when something's actual history as a writing, as a genre. And they have concluded, people have concluded who study this very, very convincingly and compellingly, Genesis chapter 1 is very clearly historical narrative. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on here.
Of course, there are other Christian scholars that say that Genesis 1 was intended as a prologue or literary framework, and that it was never intended as a historical narrative.
Now, this often comes up, does it really matter? And a lot of people will say, look, why are we even arguing over this? It's not a big issue. It's not worth even discussing. But is that really true? Is this an issue that is worth knowing the truth about? And can we get at the truth?
Absolutely. It's very important. Anyone who wants to go into any of these scientific fields needs to understand the truth is the Earth is billions of years old. In order to have an understanding of things like plate tectonics or even basic geology or paleontology, you have to have an understanding of the concept of deep time. If we are looking at the Earth through a scientific lens, nothing at all makes sense unless you understand the Earth is billions of years old.
Here's how a typical discussion would go. Ken Ham, he's the young Earth creationist. He's the president of Answers in Genesis. He says the Earth is 6,000 years old. That's what the Bible teaches, and that's what science shows. Hugh Ross might respond. And by the way, Hugh Ross, he has a ministry out in California, and he is probably considered the main proponent of old Earth creationism. He might respond by saying, science proves the Earth is billions of years old. You are ruining our witness by clinging to unscientific interpretations of the Bible. Genesis 1 wasn't meant to be read literally. Let's just be friends. It's not that big of a deal. And then Ken Ham might say, it's a huge deal. You're saved, but you're destroying the credibility of the Bible and the church.
What's actually destroying the credibility of the church is people like Ken Ham publishing books for children that show people riding dinosaurs with saddles on them. That's as absurd as Ken Ham suggesting there were actually dinosaurs on an ark 4,300 years ago.
And this is very frequently how a conversation of this sort will take place. Let's keep in mind that just because we're not talking strictly about salvation here and accepting Christ as our Savior doesn't mean all of a sudden Genesis isn't important. What did Jesus say about the Old Testament? He said that all of the law and the prophets, all of the Old Testament testifies of me. And so it is very important that we know the truth and stick with the truth. If we can get at it, we should get at it, grab it. We don't want to be even a little bit off from what the truth of the Scriptures are teaching. And we want to do the best we can to understand what that truth is and grab hold of it.
Well, you guys try to work that out, but I'm more interested in what Kevin Conover says about the age of the Earth and his evidence for it.
Okay, so let's say that one day you were scuba diving. I don't know if you like scuba diving. I personally haven't been scuba diving, only snorkeling. But let's say you were scuba diving and you were looking for treasure. Okay, so let's say as you're scuba diving, you find a whole bunch of coins. And the coins have different dates all over them. One of the coins dates to 1750, another dates to 1710, and another dates to 1695. Based on these dates, or which of these dates is the most important date in helping you to determine when the boat sank? I'll give you a chance to guess. Okay, the answer is 1750. Why is that the most important date? Because if that date, that's the most recent date, if that's on there, what that tells us is the boat could not have sank prior to 1750, or there wouldn't be a coin from 1750 on the boat. Now, it doesn't tell us exactly when the boat sank, but it does tell us that the boat could not have sank before 1750. This is called a limiting factor. It helps us establish a maximum time frame in which the boat could have sank, even though it doesn't identify exactly when the boat sank. And this is also useful in helping us understand how old the Earth is. There are many limiting factors all over the world that help us to understand how old the Earth is and its maximum age.
I'm holding in my hand here some banded iron from the Jack Hills Formation in Australia that's over 3 billion years old. We have rock on the Earth's crust that has been dated to over 4 billion years old. So there's your established minimum right there.
One of those is the population. You may be aware that the population topped 7.1 billion at the start of 2014. That's according to U.S. News. And if this is true, and we have a consistent rate of population growth, this tells us the Earth could only be so old, otherwise we would have more people. Okay, so if we go back in time, and we're looking at the amount of people on this chart, we're at 7.1 billion people at 2014. What that means is the Earth really can't be much older than 6,000 years old. In fact, if we were to go back about 4,400 years, we would end up with just about 8 people. which is exactly what the Bible tells us.
The human population argument for the age of the earth is about the most absurd one out there, but that doesn't stop Kevin from using it. The fact is that humans have only been around for a fraction of time that the earth has been here, and modern humans just a fraction of that.
Now, the problem for an evolutionary perspective or an old earth perspective is this. Old earth and evolution teaches that humans have been here as we are today for 200,000 years. Now, we evolved from a chimp-like ancestor 2.5 million years, but we've been here as humans for about 200,000 years.
Why is that a problem? We weren't the first humans. He's ignoring the entire fossil record from the last 2.5 million years and many transitional species.
Now, based on the rate of population growth, we would expect that there would be a lot more people in the world if we've been around here for that long. Now, somebody might say, well, they probably all died off. There was some sort of mass catastrophe and lots of people died.
Well, no, that's not what people say, but let's look to our closest cousin, the chimpanzee, for a good explanation. Chimps have been evolving from our common ancestor as long as we have, so why aren't there billions and billions of chimps in every corner of the world? The reason we don't have billions of chimps everywhere is they're limited geographically by their environment and their technology. Some early human species established populations in Europe and Asia, but it wasn't until modern humans left Africa within the last 70,000 years with new technology that we saw them establish populations all across the world.
But the problem is we only have about 8,000 hominid fossils all over the world. Now, some people will complain, how come we don't have more human fossils? If there was a worldwide flood that killed everybody, where are all the human fossils? Well, first of all, you have to recognize it's very difficult to make a fossil. A fossil is made by being covered very quickly with mud and then water leaching through the mud and replacing the bone with minerals. That's what creates a fossil.
Isn't that exactly what would have happened, though, if a whole lot of early humans died in a worldwide flood? Creationists teach that all these animals, including humans, died at the same time during a worldwide flood, yet we've never found one single human fossil originating from the same layers as a dinosaur.
The bone acts as a sort of cast, and then the minerals go into the shape of the bone.
No, the minerals slowly replace the original material or bone. It's a process called permineralization.
Now, somebody might ask, where are all the bones from the flood?
I did.
Well, there's a harder question here, and that is, where are all the people from evolution if we've been here for 200,000 years? And if they died, then where are all their fossils, right? Because from an evolutionary perspective, you should have either a whole lot of people or a whole lot of fossils. But we don't have either one. Okay, so this is a limiting factor, and this tells us the Earth can't possibly be as old as evolutionists claim.
You see what he did there? He totally avoids the question about where are all the human fossils from the worldwide flood by asking another question. Just a minute before, he was telling us how rare fossilization is. There's a lot of reasons why we haven't found too many human fossils, and one of the reasons is we've only been looking for about 150 years. Our understanding of where we should be looking for them is actually a lot more recent than that. We're finding new human and hominin fossils all the time, and it certainly isn't a problem for evolution.
Is the world overcrowded? Well, if you've been to a water park during summertime, you might think that it is. I try to avoid those because of the contaminants in the water. But regardless, the world is not overcrowded. There is a view out there that says that humans are destroying the planet because there's too many of us. We're eating all the food up, we're using up all the oxygen, we're killing all the animals. And to a degree, it's true that humans are damaging the world. There are many humans that are out there damaging the world, but there are also many humans that are actually doing a lot of good for the world too. The real problem isn't the amount of people, the real problem is sin. Right? If we don't utilize our resources well, then people suffer for it. But you can have a very crowded place that has embraced godly principles, and even if there's a lot of people, they'll do just fine. The more people you have, the more economic energy that is put forth, and the more good that can happen.
We're now seeing different species going extinct at an alarming rate. Humans are a direct cause of this. We're changing their environment, or we're hunting or poaching them into extinction.
According to National Geographic, now Thomas Malthus was a man who said, look, there's only so much resources in the world, and the more people you have, the smaller the pie gets. Now, his position, I don't believe, was a good one. His position was wrong. The more people you have, the more resources they can harvest and produce. And so God has given us plenty of what we need in order to have a very, very, very highly populated world. In fact, you could put all the people in the whole world right in San Diego County, California. There is plenty of room. It's over 117 billion square feet, San Diego County, and there's only around between 7 and 8 billion people in the world. Now, of course, we couldn't all live in San Diego County, but the fact of the matter is still, everybody on planet Earth could be fit right into San Diego County. There is plenty of resources in the world for people to do just fine.
Well, if we couldn't all live there, why even make the stupid argument?
And if you've ever traveled the country, you've seen lots of open space and lots of resources that haven't been utilized. So it's just a matter of us doing a better job of using our resources.
Actually, those resources and these wide open spaces are disappearing at an alarming rate. Massive deforestation and the destruction of rainforests is contributing to changes in our atmosphere and our environment. These practices are adding more and more species to the endangered list every day.
If it was true that evolution was right and we've been here for 200,000 years, you'd have 150,000 people per square inch on planet Earth. Now that would be a whole lot of people, and that'd be a serious problem. And again, if they've died out, then we should see bones everywhere, but we don't. And this speaks to the truth of the biblical record. Jacques Cousteau said in order to stabilize world population, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. This is the idea that in order to treat the earth well, we've got to get rid of people. People are the problem. Does God say this? No, God doesn't say this. This is a humanistic worldview that says we've got to get rid of people. Ted Turner of CNN said a total world population of 250 to 300 million people, a 95% decline from present levels would be ideal. Wow, that's horrible. You know, the only problem with people who make these kind of statements is they're never willing to take the first step, right? Why don't they be the first one to take that step and say, hey, here, let me help solve the problems, I'll go. Charles Worster of the Environmental Defense Fund said, people are the cause of all the problems. We have too many of them. We need to get rid of some of them, and this ban of DDT is as good a way as any. And essentially what he's saying here is, if we can get rid of the chemical that kills the bugs, then the bugs will eat the plants and less people will be able to survive. There won't be as much food for people to eat. What a horrible, horrible idea or worldview. The Convention on Biological Diversity happened in 1993, and Bill Clinton signed it. It said we must either reduce the Earth's human population to 1 billion or reduce the standard of living to an agrarian peasant status. Christianity is our foe. If animal rights is to succeed, we must destroy the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. That's Peter Singer. He's a professor at Princeton. He favors killing babies up to 28 days old. He's considered the father of animal rights. He's actually, I believe, expanded this, saying that he would be okay with killing babies up to 2 years old. The world has cancer, and the cancer is man. So you see, this is a real worldview. It's a perspective. It's an atheistic worldview. And when you begin to reject God and embrace atheism, you see people as nothing more significant than another animal. And we've got plenty of people, so supply and demand, let's get rid of some of the people so we can save the rhinos or save the gorillas or save the ants even, right?
Well, I got news for Kevin Conover. Jacques Cousteau has never been an atheist. Ted Turner's no longer an atheist either. He considers himself agnostic.
If I could be reincarnated, I would wish to return to Earth as a killer virus to lower human population levels. And that was Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth, president of the World Wildlife Fund.
Well, Prince Philip was brought up in a devoutly religious family and never considered himself an atheist.
So regardless of of the future and how you think we should deal with the problems of people not having enough food, the fact remains that according to the population, we've only been here for around 6,000 years at the most.
Well, Kevin Conover certainly hasn't demonstrated that, and he keeps getting off track on his lesson, trying to discredit atheists.
Based on DNA studies, scientists are now putting forth a theory that there was a catastrophe 70,000 years ago that reduced the human population to a few thousand, creating a genetic bottleneck. They propose that a volcano caused this near extinction of mankind. Now, sure, there was definitely a catastrophe, but it wasn't some sort of a volcanic explosion. It was a worldwide flood. And there is a genetic bottleneck if you look back. But this comes from the fact that Noah and his 3 sons were all related, so they had the same genes, and Noah's wife and his son's 3 wives were not related, which was a wider variation in the genes. And this is also why some evolutionists think women have evolved faster than men. And so you have this here. The Bible, genetics is also proving that the flood was a real event. Noah was real. These things actually happened.
So Noah's wife and his son's 3 wives were not related to Noah and his sons, but all humans came from a single couple less than 2,000 years before that? The Toba catastrophe theory, with a volcano erupting 70,000 years ago and causing a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck among small populations of humans that were left, is over 20 years old and still not widely accepted. It also has absolutely nothing to do with the age of the earth. As far as women evolving faster than men, it makes no sense biologically or from any evolutionary standpoint. I've never heard of such a thing. I've never heard of anyone proposing such a thing. And on that note, we will stop and I will wrap up this episode and look forward to doing another one next week.